On the night of February 8, 1944, a German officer lay in a forward position on the Anzio beachhead in the flat reclaimed farmland south of Rome and could not sleep. He had been told this was the stronger side of the line. His army held the high ground that ringed the beachhead. His artillery could reach almost every yard of the open plain below. By every calculation that made sense to him, the Americans penned against the sea down there should have been the frightened ones, digging deep, keeping their heads low, and waiting for the shelling to end. Instead, it was the officer who lay awake, listening to the dark, because the dark had stopped belonging to him. The men on the other side of the wire did not behave like soldiers who knew they were surrounded. They behaved like hunters. They came out at night into the strip of no man's land between the lines, crawling through reeds and drainage ditches, and they appeared at the edge of his outpost without warning. A position that had been quiet an hour before would erupt with grenades, and by the time a flare climbed into the sky to find them, they were gone. They wore strange, loose trousers, gathered and bloused into their boots, and they moved with a confidence that did not match their situation at all. And so this officer, on the strong side of the line, did the only thing left to a man who cannot understand what is happening to him. He took out a diary, and he tried to put the feeling into words. We know he did this because the diary was later found, and the words were kept. He wrote that American parachutists, devils in baggy pants, were less than 100 meters from his outpost line. He wrote that he could not sleep at night because they appeared from nowhere, and no one ever knew when or how they would strike next. And he wrote, almost helplessly, that it seemed as though these black-hearted devils were everywhere at once. His name is lost. The diary does not survive in the original German. What comes down to us is the translation his enemies kept, because the phrase he reached for in his fear said something about them that they could not have said better about themselves. Devils in baggy pants. The men he was describing belonged to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army. And the question this whole story turns on is the same question that kept that officer awake. Why were these men so dangerous, so far out of proportion to their numbers, that an enemy on the stronger ground felt himself to be the prey? The answer is not that they were simply brave. Plenty of soldiers on every side of that war were brave. The answer goes deeper, into how these men were chosen, how they were trained, what they were taught to do when everything fell apart, and what their commanders permitted them to do without being told. It is a story about a particular idea of how to make a soldier, an idea the German army, for all its skill, never quite managed to answer. And it begins not in the mud of Italy, but with the trousers themselves. If this story moves you, a like genuinely helps it reach other people who care about these men and what they did. And if you are new here, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to keep stories like this one from being forgotten. Start with the baggy pants, because the name was not a metaphor. It was a description of what these men actually looked like. American paratroopers wore a uniform built for jumping out of an aircraft, a jacket and trousers with large bellows pockets sewn onto the thighs to carry the tools of war down through the sky. When a paratrooper dressed, he gathered the bottoms of those trousers and tucked them tightly into the tops of his tall leather jump boots, blousing the fabric so it would not catch the wind or snag on the door of the plane. The result was a baggy, gathered silhouette, fabric bunched at the thigh and bloused at the boot that no ordinary infantryman wore. To a German soldier seeing these men up close in the dark, that strange shape was the first thing he noticed. The baggy pants were a uniform, but they were also a sign. They marked a man who had volunteered to do something most soldiers would never agree to do, because that is the first thing to understand about the regiment. Nobody was simply assigned to be a paratrooper. You had to step forward and volunteer, knowing exactly what the job was. The job was to load yourself with weapons and equipment, climb into an aircraft, and at a signal hurl yourself out of the open door while the plane was in flight, often at night, to fall through the dark and land in ground held by the enemy, frequently scattered far from your own officers and mixed up with strangers. The army made the path to that uniform deliberately hard. Airborne training at Fort Benning in Georgia, where the regiment was activated on the 1st of May, 1942, was built to break the men who did not truly want it. The physical standard was punishing. The washout rate was high. Men ran everywhere they went. They did endless calisthenics in the Georgia heat. They jumped from towers, then from planes, again and again, until the act of stepping into empty air became something they could force themselves to do on command. The army knew it was asking for something unusual, and it paid for it. A paratrooper received extra money on top of his regular wage, what the soldiers called jump pay. An enlisted paratrooper earned an additional $50 every month, and an officer an additional $100. That may sound small now. Set it against the fact that an ordinary private in 1942 earned only around $21 a month, and the scale becomes clear. The army was more than doubling a man's pay to persuade him to jump. The men joked that they were being paid to risk their necks, and they were right. But the money was never really why they came. They came, as their own commander once put it, because they liked excitement and adventure, because they wanted to be part of something new and different, because they wanted to be among the first into the most dangerous places on the battlefield. Even the uniform that gave them their name had been designed by an airborne man for airborne work. The distinctive jumpsuit, with its blouse, trousers, and bellows pockets, had been developed in the early days of the American Parachute Force by one of its pioneers, an officer named William Yarborough, who would himself go on to lead a battalion of the 504th in Sicily. Everything about these men, from the cut of their trousers to the boots laced high on their calves, marked them as a deliberate experiment. A new kind of soldier the United States was building almost from scratch. The regiment that wore it had been activated under a different commander at first, and it was Major General Matthew Ridgway, building the 82nd Airborne into a fighting division, who removed that first commander and reached down for the young officer he believed could turn these volunteers into something fearsome. The man he chose in the final days of 1942 was Reuben Tucker. It would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the division's history. That self-selection did something to the regiment that is very hard to manufacture any other way. It filled the ranks with men who did not think of themselves as cogs in a machine, waiting to be told what to do. It filled them with men who had personally chosen the hardest road the army offered, and who carried, as a result, a particular kind of confidence. It was the confidence that said, "If this goes wrong, I do not wait to be rescued. I act." Multiply that across a whole regiment, and you have a body of soldiers, each of whom expects, in a crisis, to be the one who steps up. That was the raw material. The question was whether it could be shaped into something disciplined rather than merely reckless. The answer to that question had a name, and the name was Reuben Tucker. Colonel Reuben Henry Tucker III commanded the 504th, and he was, by the standards of high command, startlingly young for the job. He had been born in Connecticut in 1911, graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1935, and taken command of the regiment when he was barely past 30, one of the youngest regimental commanders in the army. His men called him the Little Colonel, with affection, because he was not a physically imposing man. The officers who watched him fight came away with a much larger impression. James Gavin, who would rise to command the entire 82nd Airborne Division, wrote afterward that Tucker was probably the best regimental commander of the war. That is an extraordinary thing to say in an army full of fine regiments, and Tucker earned it not with speeches, but with a single, unshakable conviction about how to fight. He believed that the worst thing a unit could ever do under pressure was to grow passive. He believed that when you were hit, you hit back harder, and that the surest way to die was to sit still and wait for the enemy to decide your fate. He had a way of expressing that conviction that his men would carry for the rest of their lives, and he had first shown it to them long before Anzio, on the road that forged the regiment into what the German officer would one day fear. That road did not begin with glory. It began with a catastrophe, and it is important to tell this part honestly, because the story of the 504th is not a clean tale of triumph. Their first great test came in July of 1943, in the invasion of Sicily, and the worst blow they suffered there did not come from the enemy at all. It came from their own side. On the night of the 11th of July 1943, The main body of the regiment was being flown in to reinforce the airborne troops already fighting on the island. Their transport planes, slow and unarmed, had to fly a course that took them over the vast Allied invasion fleet anchored off the Sicilian coast. That fleet had spent the day under German and Italian air attack. The gunners on the ships and on the shore were exhausted, frightened, and primed to fire at anything that appeared in the sky. When the long columns of low-flying transport planes droned overhead in the darkness, someone, somewhere, opened fire. And then, in a chain reaction that no one could stop, everyone did. Ship after ship poured anti-aircraft fire up into the formations of aircraft carrying American paratroopers. Tracers climbed in their thousands. The transports had no way to fight back, and almost no room to escape. Some were torn apart in the air, some caught fire and fell into the sea. Some men leapt from burning planes into the dark and drowned. Others died still strapped into their seats, killed by their own navy before they ever reached the fight they had volunteered for. Of roughly 144 aircraft in the operation, 23 were shot down and many more were badly damaged. Among the paratroopers, the regiment counted well over 200 casualties, with around 80 of its men killed. The air crews who flew them suffered terribly as well, with scores more dead and wounded. Among those lost was Brigadier General Charles Kierans, the assistant commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, who had gone along that night as an observer and never came back. At the time, it stood as one of the worst incidents of mistaken fire in the history of the American military. Tucker's own plane was hit again and again, its fuselage punched through with holes, and somehow it stayed in the air long enough for him to get down. The men who later counted the damage spoke of hundreds upon hundreds of bullet holes in that single aircraft. He came through that night having watched his regiment shattered by friendly guns before it had even properly entered the war. And here is the thing that matters most about that horror, the thing that connects it to the diary at Anzio. The men who survived Sicily learned, in the cruelest way imaginable, that war was chaotic and unfair, that the system could fail them completely, and that survival depended on what each man did for himself and for the man beside him, not on everything working the way the plan promised. They did not come out of that broken. They came out harder, more self-reliant, more fused to one another. The catastrophe that should have wrecked the regiment instead annealed it. 2 months later, in September of 1943, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno, and that beachhead, too, nearly collapsed under fierce German counterattacks. The 504th was thrown in to save it. On the night of the 13th of September, with the situation desperate, the men of the regiment jumped directly onto the beachhead, guided down by a great flaming letter T burning on the sand, made of gasoline-soaked earth, set alight to mark the drop zone. They jumped almost on top of their own lines because there was no time for anything subtler. And in the days that followed, in the hills around a village called Altavilla, Tucker gave his regiment the words that became its scripture. The fighting on those hills was grim, and at one point a withdrawal was being discussed, the sensible response to a position that looked untenable. Tucker's reported answer ran straight against sense, and his men never forgot it. "Retreat," he said. "Hell, send me my other battalion." Whether those were the exact words, and the regiment told the line a dozen slightly different ways over the years, every man understood the meaning perfectly. When the pressure was at its worst, Tucker's instinct was not to pull back to safety. It was to ask for more men so that he could attack. He held those hills, and for his leadership there he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the first of 2 he would earn in the war. That instinct, to answer a crisis by striking rather than retreating, was about to define everything that happened to the regiment in the months ahead. After Salerno came the mountains, and the mountains were a different kind of war. Through the cold end of 1943, the regiment fought its way up the rocky spine of southern Italy, into the brutal high ground around Mount Samucro and the Mignano Gap, a corridor the troops came to call Purple Heart Valley for the price it exacted. In December, they climbed into that high ground to relieve exhausted units, including hard-pressed Rangers clinging to the slopes, and took over a stretch of front where the only way forward was up, across bare rock, in the teeth of an enemy dug into stone above them. There were no sweeping maneuvers here, no dash and flank. There was only the slow, freezing, deadly work of climbing a mountain that a determined defender could hold almost forever. The men learned the particular misery of it, the frostbite, and the mules that carried supplies up trails too steep for any vehicle, the wounded who had to be carried down those same trails for hours, the way a single machine gun on a ridge could stop a company cold. They dug into frozen ground and endured, and they kept climbing. By the time they were finally pulled out to refit, they were veterans of the worst the Italian campaign could offer. They were lean, hard and confident, and they had been welded together by tragedy and by mountain cold into exactly the kind of unit that does not panic when the plan dies. That is the regiment that came ashore at Anzio, and at Anzio, all of it, the volunteer ethos, the training, the commander's aggression, the hard lessons of Sicily and Salerno, and the mountains, came together into the behavior that made a German officer reach for his diary. To understand what they did there, you have to understand what Anzio was. By January of 1944, the Allied advance up Italy had stalled completely against a powerful German defensive line anchored on the mountain and monastery at Monte Cassino. The mountains favored the defender, and the campaign had become a grinding siege of stone and weather. So the Allies tried to leap over the problem. The plan, called Operation Shingle, was to land a force by sea at Anzio and Nettuno, two seaside towns barely 30 miles south of Rome and far behind the German front, and so force the Germans to turn around and fight in two directions at once. It was a bold idea, championed at the highest levels, including by Winston Churchill himself. On the 22nd of January 1944, under the command of Major General John Lucas, the landings began, and at first they went almost too well. The troops came ashore against almost no resistance. Surprise was nearly complete, and for a brief window, the road inland lay open. But the commander chose caution over speed. Rather than drive hard for the hills that ringed the beachhead, he stopped to consolidate, to build up supplies, to make himself secure before pushing on. And while he waited, the Germans did what the Germans did better than almost anyone in that war. They reacted with terrifying speed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring rushed divisions toward Anzio from every direction, and within days, the shallow Allied beachhead was ringed by a growing wall of German troops under General Eberhard von Mackensen. The high ground that the Allies had failed to seize now belonged to the enemy. From those heights, German observers could look down on almost the entire beachhead, flat and exposed below them. The trap meant to close on the Germans had, in a terrible irony, closed instead on the men who built it. For the next 4 months, Anzio would not be a breakout. It would be a siege, fought on open ground under near constant observation and fire. The 504th came ashore not by parachute, but by landing craft. A plan to drop them inland had been cancelled before the landings, judged too risky after the slaughter over Sicily. So these paratroopers fought at Anzio as elite infantry. They took up the right flank of the beachhead, alongside the United States 3rd Infantry Division, holding the line along the Mussolini Canal, a straight cut of water across the flat, waterlogged farmland southeast of the towns. To their other side, the British 1st Infantry Division had come ashore on the same January morning, for this was a shared Allied beachhead from the very start. And almost immediately, the paratroopers began to do the thing that set them apart. Life inside the beachhead was a particular kind of ordeal that shaped everything the men did. Because the Germans held the heights and could see almost everything, there was no true rear area, no safe place to rest. German artillery and a huge railway gun, the soldiers nicknamed for its size, could drop shells anywhere in the perimeter at any hour. Men lived in holes in the ground, in water that seeped up through the reclaimed marshland, under a sky that belonged as often to the enemy as to themselves. To stand up in daylight in the wrong place was to invite a shell. In those conditions, the temptation to simply endure, to keep still and survive, was overwhelming and entirely understandable. The strategic stakes made the suffering worse, because everyone knew the beachhead could not simply be abandoned. It had been bought at great cost, and it tied down an entire German army that would otherwise have reinforced the mountain line to the south. The men at Anzio were holding open a wound in the German position, and they were paying for it daily. In the last days of January, as the Allies tried to push out from the beachhead, the regiment attacked along the canal and seized a cluster of small farming hamlets, places with names like Borgo Sabatino, Borgo Piave, and Cesano. The fighting was vicious. One company, Company D, pushed out beyond Borgo Piave and was caught in the open by a sudden German counterthrust, 5 tanks and 8 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, weapons designed to shred aircraft, now turned on infantry in the open. Company D was cut off and lost heavily, though many of the men managed to crawl and infiltrate their way back to friendly lines through the dark. It was a hard, costly lesson in how dangerous this flat ground was, and a lesser unit might have drawn from it the conclusion that the sensible thing to do was to dig in deep and wait out the siege. The 504th drew the opposite conclusion. The very conditions of Anzio, the open ground, the German guns on the heights, the constant observation, pushed most units toward passivity by day and caution by night. It was the obvious response. The paratroopers refused it. Where the line settled into a static siege, they decided that the night, at least, would belong to them. They sent out patrol after patrol into no man's land, not merely to gather information, but to fight. They raided German outposts. They ambushed German patrols moving in the dark. They crawled close enough to enemy positions to hear the soldiers talking, and then struck without warning and vanished. They turned the strip of ground between the armies, which by rights belonged to no one, into their own hunting ground. The craft of it was learned and deliberate, not reckless adventuring. Before a patrol went out, the men would prepare with care, blackening their faces, taping or muffling anything that might rattle or shine, leaving behind anything that could betray them if captured. They moved in small groups along ditches and irrigation cuts, and the dead ground the German observers could not see into. They learned the enemy's habits, when the sentries changed, where the machine guns were sighted, which paths the German patrols favored, and they used that knowledge to choose the moment and the place of every fight. The point was not only to kill, the point was to make the Germans afraid of their own front line, to take from them the one thing a defender holding strong ground ought to be able to count on, which is rest. Night after night, the paratroopers reached out into the dark and reminded the men across from them that there was no safe distance, no quiet sector, no hour when they could let their guard down. It was psychological warfare, carried out one patrol at a time, and over weeks it wore on the nerves of an enemy who had every material advantage and slowly lost the feeling of being the stronger side. This is the behavior the German officer recorded in his diary. Less than 100 meters from his outpost line, appearing from nowhere, striking when and how no one could predict. To a man holding what was supposed to be the stronger position, with the high ground and the artillery, it was a maddening inversion of the whole logic of the battle. He was meant to be the besieger. In the dark, he became the besieged. And this is the point where the story rises above one frightened man's private notes, because the same impression was being formed, at the very same time, by Americans who fought beside the regiment and had no reason at all to flatter it. The 3rd Infantry Division held the line next to the paratroopers, and that division's own intelligence officers wrote down their assessment of these men in a formal report. They recorded that on the beachhead, these parachutists had caused worry and wrinkled brows only in the enemy camp. They noted that the paratroopers had shown themselves particularly qualified at night patrolling, and they observed that on many occasions these men had tackled larger numbers of the enemy than they themselves had, usually to the enemy's disadvantage. Sit with that, because it is the heart of the matter. A neighboring American division, watching with a cool and professional eye, set down in writing that these men routinely picked fights with forces larger than their own, and routinely won. That is not a slogan or a piece of propaganda. It is a sober military judgment, recorded by people who knew exactly how rare such a thing was. The fear in the German diary and the respect in the American report are describing the same single phenomenon from opposite sides of the wire. Something about this regiment made it dangerous out of all proportion to its size, and we are now close enough to name what that something was. It was not magic, and it was not simply courage. It was the way these men fought at the smallest scale, in the dark, with no officer standing over them. Consider what a fighting patrol at Anzio actually demanded. A handful of soldiers would slip out of their own lines after dark and move across open, mined, fire-swept ground toward an enemy who was listening for them. There was no commander on a radio guiding each step, and no artillery plan timed to the minute. There were just a few men, perhaps a sergeant or a junior lieutenant, and a shared understanding of the mission and of each other. Whether the patrol lived or died depended entirely on initiative at the very lowest level, on each man knowing what to do the instant the plan met reality and shattered, and on the group being able to make and remake decisions in seconds without anyone telling them how. This was precisely the kind of fighting these men had been built for, and the reason lies in the nature of the parachute assault itself. A jump scatters men across the landscape, far from their officers, jumbled together with strangers, in the dark and in chaos. Airborne training did not treat that chaos as a disaster to be avoided. It treated it as the normal starting condition of battle, and so it produced soldiers who expected to fight in small, improvised groups, who expected to take the initiative themselves, and who expected the man next to them to step into the gap if a leader fell. At Anzio, that training found its perfect expression. The night patrols did not need a colonel's hand on them. They had been made, from the very beginning, to operate exactly here, in the dark, on their own judgment. And the leadership above them did not smother that quality. It pointed it like a weapon. Tucker's whole philosophy gave the men permission to be what their training had made them. He did not tell his regiment to hunker down and survive the siege. He set a tone that said, "The night belongs to us. Go out and take it." When you combine soldiers who have been forged for independent action with a commander whose every instinct is to attack rather than wait, you get exactly what the German officer described. You get an enemy who seems to be everywhere at once, who strikes without warning, who cannot be pinned down or predicted, because his aggression does not flow from any single point that a sniper or a shell could remove. It lives in every man in the line. The German army, by contrast, fought within a more rigid frame, and this is not a criticism of German courage or skill, both of which they possessed in abundance. But their system concentrated decision and initiative more tightly, higher up the chain, and their posture at Anzio was that of the attacker working to a plan handed down from above. When that plan was running, they were formidable beyond question. They proved it in February, when they very nearly drove the whole Allied force into the sea. But in the small war of the night patrol, the war of the raid and the ambush, and the individual nerve, they were facing men who had been specifically created for that exact fight, and who had a commander cheering them out into the dark. The great German effort to destroy the beachhead came in 2 waves, and the regiment met the worst of its share before the largest blow even fell. In the first days of February, the Germans struck hard at the Allied positions, and the heaviest of that fighting fell, for the 504th, on its 3rd Battalion, which was holding forward ground in close cooperation with the British 1st Infantry Division. Because Anzio was never an American battle alone, it was a combined Allied beachhead from the first hour, and British divisions, British tanks, British gunners, and British commandos bled there alongside the Americans through the whole long siege. In those early February days, roughly the 6th through the 12th, the 3rd Battalion fought some of the most desperate close-quarter actions of the entire campaign. One company, H Company, was sent forward into a gap and pushed on to a railroad embankment far ahead of friendly lines, only to discover that the troops who should have been protecting its flank were not there. The company found itself isolated, cut off, deep in contested ground, reduced by casualties to a couple of dozen men and a handful of officers, holding on through roughly a full day and night while the Germans pressed in around it. To reach them, I Company attacked across open ground swept by fire. Its commander, Lieutenant Roy Hanna, was shot through the chest, his lung filling so that he collapsed again and again, and each time he forced himself back to his feet and went on directing his men until the isolated company was relieved. By the time the survivors of I Company broke through, they numbered only 16. Hanna lived and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for refusing to leave a fight he was physically dying in the middle of. That is what the doctrine of aggression looked like at the cost of flesh and blood. It was not a slogan. It was a man with a hole in his lung, getting up off the ground for the 4th time because the men ahead needed him. For its conduct in those days, from the 8th to the 12th of February, the 3rd Battalion of the 504th received one of the first Presidential Unit citations awarded in the European theatre, a distinction reserved for units whose performance in combat rises above and beyond the ordinary call. And then, on the 16th of February, the Germans launched their largest blow of all, a massive, carefully prepared offensive aimed at splitting the beachhead in two and driving the Allies back into the water. Wave after wave of infantry and armor came down against the perimeter under tremendous artillery fire. For several days the outcome genuinely hung in the balance, and only a desperate Allied defense, with artillery firing at a furious rate and every available man thrown into the line, fought the offensive to a standstill. The beachhead survived, and the men of the 504th, who had already given so much in the first half of the month, had played their part in proving that this enemy, even at the height of its strength, could not break them. This is the deepest answer to the question the diary raises, the question of why men who could have hidden chose instead to go out and attack. It was not that they failed to understand their danger, they understood it perfectly, better than anyone, because they paid for that understanding nightly. It was that they had been selected, trained, and led to believe a particular thing in their bones, that aggression was survival, that the unit which seized the initiative controlled the fight, and that passivity in the face of a stronger enemy was only a slower way to die. The German officer could not sleep because the men across from him had decided, as a matter of doctrine and of character, that they would rather be the thing moving in the dark than the thing the dark was coming for. The cost of that decision was carved deep into the regiment. Across the whole Italian campaign, the 504th suffered just over 1,100 casualties, and roughly a quarter of those, just under 600 men, fell at Anzio alone. 2 of the regiment's 3 battalion commanders became casualties. These were not numbers paid lightly or without grief. Every successful patrol was balanced against the knowledge of friends who did not come back across the wire. The legend of the devils in baggy pants was never a costume. It was paid for in the lives of specific young men, on specific freezing nights, along a canal in Italy, and the regiment carried that price with it for the rest of the war. When the 504th was finally pulled out of Anzio in the spring of 1944 and shipped to England, it was so depleted, so worn down and short of replacements, that it could not be made ready in time for the great airborne assault on D-Day. The rest of the 82nd Airborne dropped into Normandy in June. The 504th, the regiment that had earned the division's fiercest reputation in Italy, had to sit that one out, with only a handful of its pathfinders taking part, while it rebuilt from everything Italy had cost it. There is a hard irony in that. The unit had bled so heavily proving what it was that it missed the most famous airborne operation in history. But the war was far from finished with them, and the reputation forged in the dark at Anzio was about to be tested again, in broad daylight, in the open, in a feat so audacious that the British soldiers who watched it could scarcely believe their eyes. That feat came in September of 1944, in the Netherlands, in the great airborne offensive known as Operation Market Garden. The plan was to seize a chain of bridges across the rivers and canals of Holland, and so open a corridor for a rapid Allied drive into Germany. The 82nd Airborne's share of the task included the great road bridge over the Waal River at the city of Nijmegen. But the Germans held the bridge and the far bank, and repeated attempts to rush it from the near side failed. So a decision was made to do something that veteran soldiers regarded as very close to suicide. A battalion of the 504th would cross the wide, fast-flowing Waal in broad daylight, in small boats, directly into the teeth of the German defences, and seize the far end of the bridge from behind. The man given that crossing was Major Julian Cook, commanding the 3rd Battalion, the same battalion that had been bled white at Anzio and rebuilt with new men. The boats arrived late, and they were not what anyone had hoped for. They were flimsy craft of canvas and plywood, supplied by the British, brought up at the last moment, and there were too few of them, 26 instead of the 33 that had been promised, the rest lost to German shelling on the way to the river. The Vaal at that point was some 400 yards across, broad and open, with no cover of any kind on the water. On the far bank, the Germans waited with machine guns, with 20mm cannon, and with the dreaded 88mm guns, all sighted to sweep the surface of the river from end to end. To cross there, in daylight, in canvas boats, was to paddle slowly across an open killing ground while the enemy fired down the length of it. In the middle of the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, the first wave pushed off, 260 men crammed into the little boats, with so few paddles that many of them dug at the water with the butts of their rifles. Major Cook, a devout man, is remembered reciting the words of a prayer over and over as he paddled, a Hail Mary timed to each stroke, because there was nothing else a man could do but pray and pull. What followed was one of the most harrowing few minutes of the entire campaign in the West. The river erupted. Shell bursts walked across the surface in geysers of white water. Machine gun fire stitched the boats, and the men packed into them. Boats were hit and folded and sank. Men were killed in midstream and tipped into the current, and still the survivors paddled, because the only thing more dangerous than going forward across that water was stopping on it. Roughly half the boats reached the far shore. The men who landed did not pause to gather themselves. They came out of the boats and went straight at the German positions on the bank, overrunning them with a fury sharpened by everything they had just endured on the water. Among them were men whose names the regiment would remember: Captain Carl Kappel, leading H Company in the first wave, Lieutenant James Magellas, and Captain Moffat Burris, carrying the fight inland, the same hard veterans who had patrolled the dark at Anzio. They drove the defenders back, took the northern end of the railway bridge, and then the great road bridge itself, attacking from the rear, while British Guards tanks pressed across from the front. The crossing had been supported throughout by British fire, by the guns of the Royal Artillery, and by Sherman tanks of the Guards, and by Typhoon fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force strafing the far bank. The bridge fell, and the crossing was not over when the first wave reached the far shore, because there were more men to bring across, and only a fraction of the boats left to do it. Of the 26 craft that had set out, only around 11 were still fit to float after that first passage, and the men who had survived the trip turned those battered boats around and rowed back across the same fire, swept water to fetch the next wave. They did it again and again. The handful of soldiers who paddled back into that storm, having just lived through it once, to do it a second and a third time, were performing an act of courage that is almost harder to grasp than the first crossing, because they knew exactly what they were going back into. One of the battalion's officers who lived through it, a man who had rowed competitively in his youth, struggled afterward to describe the chaos of that water, the boats spinning, the men falling, the river simply churned to foam by fire. There were no words built for it. The British officers watching from the near side were men not given to easy praise of their American allies, and what they had just seen left them shaken. From a high vantage point above the river, the British airborne commander, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, who had watched the whole crossing, turned and said that they were magnificent troops to move forward like that, and that any nation should be proud of them. A British tank commander watching the same scene simply exclaimed at the display of courage in front of him. The crossing cost the battalion roughly 48 men killed, and to this day their sacrifice is honoured at the river they crossed, where each evening a long line of paired lights is lit, one after another, in a slow procession across the modern bridge, one pair for each of the men who did not make it across alive. It was in these same days of fighting around Nijmegen that the regiment earned the only Medal of Honor it would receive in the entire war, and the story of how it was earned is the purest distillation of everything the devils in baggy pants were. The man was Private John Towle, from Cleveland, Ohio. He was 19 years old. He had been born in October of 1924, had enlisted in 1943, and had volunteered, like all of them, for the airborne. On the 21st of September 1944, near the village of Oosterhout, the newly won bridgehead, north of the river, came under a heavy German counterattack. A strong enemy force of around 100 infantry, supported by 2 tanks and a half-track, formed up and advanced against the thinly held American line. Towle was the rocket launcher gunner for his company. What he did next was set down, word for word, in the official citation for the nation's highest award for valor. Without being ordered, and entirely on his own judgment, Towle left the relative safety of his foxhole and moved 200 yards forward, through intense small arms fire, to an exposed position on a raised dike roadbed, from which he could engage the whole attack alone. From there he fired on both German tanks, scoring hits that damaged them and forced them to pull back. When a group of 9 German soldiers occupied a nearby house and threatened the position, he turned his rocket launcher on the building and, with a single round, killed all 9 of them. Then he saw the half-track, and he set off forward again, alone, rushing more than 100 yards across open ground to bring it under fire. As he knelt and prepared to shoot, a mortar shell burst beside him, and he was mortally wounded. He had, by himself, broken the back of an attack that outnumbered his entire position many times over, and he had done it acting on nothing but his own decision that the moment demanded it, and that he was the man who could answer. There is the whole story in one young life. No officer ordered Towle out of that foxhole. There was no time, and no plan that could have. He went because he had been made into a soldier who saw a crisis and moved toward it on his own judgment, exactly as the night patrols had moved out into the dark at Anzio on their own judgment. The very same quality that made a frightened German officer write that these men appeared from nowhere and struck without warning is the quality that sent a 19-year-old 200 yards forward, alone, to take on 100 men and 2 tanks. It was initiative raised to the level of instinct. It was the entire doctrine of the regiment written in the actions of one private who would not live to see the result. He was the only man of the 504th to receive the Medal of Honor in the entire war, and he never knew it. The medal was given to his family, months later, in his name. The war still had one greater test for them, and it came in the snow. In December of 1944, when the Germans launched their last desperate gamble in the West, the surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the 504th was rushed to Belgium by truck to help stem the breakthrough. Near a village called Cheneux, the regiment was thrown against part of the armoured spearhead, driving deepest into the American line, an elite German battle group that had already left a trail of destruction behind it. The attack the paratroopers had to make was as grim as anything they had faced. They had to cross open ground, a field some 400 yards wide, strung with belts of barbed wire, into the heaviest concentrated fire the regiment had ever met. The cost was terrible. 2 of the assaulting companies, B and C, were all but destroyed in the attack. When it was over, only 18 men remained standing in Company B, and Company C was reduced to 38 men and 3 officers. One of the men who made that charge, Staff Sergeant William Walsh, his hand torn open by fire, destroyed a German anti-aircraft gun with a grenade and earned the Distinguished Service Cross for it. But they took the position, and they handed the Germans one of the first hard checks of that whole offensive, with the same furious aggression that had defined them since Italy. It crossed the Rhine into Germany, and in the final days of the war some of its men came upon one of the Nazi concentration camps, at a place called Wobbelin, and saw with their own eyes the thing they had ultimately been fighting against, the starved and the dead behind the wire. James Magellas, who by then had earned a Distinguished Service Cross of his own for crawling forward alone in Holland to destroy a German machine gun nest, was among those early into that camp. It was a reminder, if any of them needed one, of what the whole long road from Sicily had been for. The regiment finished the war on occupation duty in the ruins of Berlin, where the 82nd Airborne earned a final name, America's Guard of Honor. The men who had been devils in baggy pants in the mud of Anzio stood in clean ranks in the enemy's shattered capital. The war won. It is worth pausing on what their long ordeal in Italy had actually achieved, because the meaning of Anzio is easy to lose in the suffering of it. The beachhead the 504th had helped to hold, at such cost, pinned an entire German army in place for 4 months. When the breakout finally came in late spring, the Allies entered Rome on the 5th of June 1944. The very next morning, the great invasion fleet appeared off Normandy, and the world's attention turned forever to that beach. The men who had bled at Anzio liberated the first Axis capital of the war, and then watched their triumph vanish from the headlines within a single day, eclipsed by the landings in France that some of their own brothers in the 82nd were jumping into even then. There is something fitting, and a little heartbreaking in that. These were never men who fought for the headlines. So we come back, at the last, to the diary, and to the frightened officer who wrote it, and to the question of what he had actually seen. He never knew the full answer, and in a sense the German army never did either. He thought he was describing a particularly troublesome enemy regiment, men in strange trousers who would not let him sleep. What he was really describing, without ever having the words for it, was an entire philosophy of how to make a soldier. He was looking at what happens when an army selects only volunteers for its hardest units, trains them to function inside chaos, and to expect the sudden absence of orders, fills them with the conviction that to attack is to survive, and then places over them a commander whose every instinct is to strike rather than to wait. The result was not a unit you could defeat by killing its leaders or by getting inside its plan, because its strength did not live in any single head where a bullet could find it. It lived, distributed, in every man. That was the thing the Germans could not simply copy, and it is worth being precise about why, because the reason is not the obvious one. It was not that German soldiers lacked courage or skill. They had both in abundance, and in many areas their tactical craft was the envy of the world. The difference was that the quality the 504th carried grew out of choices made long before any battlefield, out of a culture that pushed real initiative and real trust all the way down to the lowest ranks, that expected a 19-year-old private to leave his hole without orders and decide the shape of a battle by himself. You cannot manufacture that in a single campaign by issuing a directive. It grows slowly, out of how you choose your men, how you train them, what you allow them to do without asking permission, and what you celebrate when they do it. The devils in baggy pants were the product of an entire system that had decided, deliberately, to build soldiers who did not need to be told. The men who built and carried that reputation did not vanish when the war ended, though many of them never came home at all. Reuben Tucker, the little colonel, survived, and spent years afterward shaping young soldiers as the commandant of cadets at a great American military college. His life carried its share of sorrow into peacetime. His own son was killed in action years later, in another war, in Vietnam, and when Tucker died in 1970, he was laid to rest near that son. James McGellis, the lieutenant who had crossed the Vaal and patrolled the dark at Anzio, became the most decorated officer in the entire history of the 82nd Airborne Division, and he lived a very long life, dying at the age of 103, carrying the memory of those men into the 21st century. Private John Towle, who was 19, never saw the bridgehead he had saved hold firm, and lies today in the city where he was born. And many hundreds more never made it home at all. They lie in the war cemeteries of Italy and Holland and Belgium, under long, quiet rows of white stone, beside the British and Canadian and Polish soldiers with whom they shared those campaigns. Anzio, in particular, is a place of the Allied dead of many nations. Along that stretch of Italian coast, in the cemeteries maintained for the soldiers of the Commonwealth, lie well over 3,000 British and Imperial servicemen, the young men of the British 1st Division, and the other formations that had landed on the same January morning and held the same terrible perimeter. The Americans in their baggy trousers had never fought their war alone. They had fought it shoulder to shoulder with British gunners and British infantry and British tank crews, at Anzio and again at the Vaal, and the ground where so many of them rest is shared ground, a common grave for a common cause. To remember the devils in baggy pants honestly is to remember the men who fought beside them too. The German officer wrote that it seemed as though these black-hearted devils were everywhere. He meant it as fear, but in a way he could not have intended. He had paid them the highest compliment one soldier can pay another. He had confessed that he could not understand them, could not predict them, and could not rest while they were near. He had stood on the strong side of the line, with the high ground and the guns and every advantage the map could give him, and still the men in the gathered, bloused trousers had taken the night away from him and made him the hunted one. The German army never did solve the puzzle of how an enemy could be beaten in every calculation on paper and still own the darkness in fact. They only knew the feeling of it, and one of them, lying awake on a cold night south of Rome, wrote that feeling down, and so the name has outlasted the war, and the men, and the fear that gave it life. The devils in baggy pants. Now you know who they really were. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, the single best thing you can do to help it find others is to give it a like. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good moment, because we tell these stories here so that the men who lived them are not forgotten. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from today. And if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a name spoken quietly at the dinner table, tell me about them below. Every one of those men carried a story like this one. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not lost.